How do you define a moment? How do you define a moment in time that when it happens, hardly anybody knows about it, but yet it is a moment that will change the world forever? How do you define a moment when millions of dreams suddenly come true, carried on the wind? It was a moment when man overpowered heaven, a moment when simple mortals did the work of gods, a moment when jaws dropped. There is a photograph of that moment, but the man who took that photo would later say that he never thought he would be able to take that photo because he thought the people he was helping were crazy. But you see, the dream did happen. Just after noon on December 17th, 1903, that moment happened, a moment that would change the world forever. After millions of years of watching the birds with envy, man, mortal man, turned his face into the wind and flew. To be honest about it, the realization that they had actually flown in controlled flight even amazed Orville and Wilbur Wright, because so many other people had tried to fly and they had failed. But you see, the Wright brothers had an uncanny knack. They watched the birds summer after summer, and they discovered a process that is called wing warping, which is what they discovered the birds did. It was the breakthrough that made powered, controlled flight possible. The press was skeptical. Most people ignored their flight. And because of this, the Wright brothers kept their invention in secret for 4 years, during which time they slowly improved their planes. Finally, Wilbur took one of the Wright flyers to Paris. He wanted to go to France because the French had tried so hard to perfect the airplane, and they had nearly done it. And on the day before Wilbur's flight, there was a huge headline in the biggest selling newspaper in Paris that called him the bluffer. But the Wright brothers were not bluffing. He flew through Paris skies, and suddenly the French press completely reversed. They hailed this bicycle maker from Ohio as the world's newest hero. While Wilbur was fascinating the French, Orville was in Washington, D.C. playing salesman. He was trying to convince the U.S. Army that they needed to buy some of these planes. He tested the planes, demonstrated them on a hillside overlooking Washington, D.C., near what is now the Arlington Cemetery. And it was during those demonstrations that another milestone in aviation was recorded. You see, the Army demanded that he take a passenger with him. They wanted a plane that could carry a pilot and someone else who could be engaged in aerial spying. Orville didn't like the idea, and he liked it even less when he found out who his passenger was to be, a member of the Signal Corps named Thomas Selfridge. The problem was Selfridge was working with Glenn Curtiss and the legendary Alexander Graham Bell. That group was trying to perfect a better airplane. On September 17, 1908, Orville Wright and Thomas Selfridge went up in a plane. Everything went well for a while. Then a piece of propeller flew off. It shattered the plane. It crashed to the ground. Orville Wright survived. Thomas Selfridge died. He became the first person to ever die in a plane crash. There is a monument along Highway 50 in Arlington, Virginia, that memorializes that event. But as so often would happen in the history of aviation, a negative event had positive results. They took that plane to a shed, and Alexander Graham Bell sneaked in. He took measurements and took notes, and he used that information to improve his own airplane, which in turn improved all of aviation. And in spite of the fact that the Wright Flyer had crashed, the Army thought enough of it to order several, rejecting the design of Bell and Curtiss. Suddenly, the plane became a military weapon when World War I broke out, dogfights and reconnaissance missions. It was only after World War I that the common man first began to fly. The Roaring Twenties were underway, and there was a new interest in flying, but there were no paved airports, and airports that were there were few and far between. Aviation was a very costly hobby. Only two kinds of people could really fly, and both of them had to have money: daredevils and people who were good at fixing things. If only there were a way to get aviation to pay off, and suddenly they discovered a way. These early pioneer pilots simply started showing off and charging for it. They flew at county fairs. They were soon called barnstormers because America was mostly rural and they were flying over the tops of barns. They caused near riots in places, and they charged what at that time was a lot of money, 25 cents, to go up in a plane. Suddenly cities were building airports. They even paved runways. But the demand for airline travel was outpacing the development of better airplanes. Aging equipment, constant wrecks, near misses soon became the hallmark of the American aviation industry. It would take the death in a plane crash of one of the world's best-loved personalities that would move airline travel to another, faster, safer level. The man who died in the plane crash was a lovable Norwegian immigrant who was the epitome of the American dream. He was so loved that when he died, there was a kind of hush all over the world. A global network of radio stations carried his funeral live. Millions listened that April 1931 morning. 2,000 newspapers devoted most of their front page to coverage of the funeral. The man the world was mourning was the feisty coach of the Notre Dame football program, charismatic Knute Rockne. Rockne was more than the man who invented the forward pass, which of course revolutionized football. Around the world, Knute Rockne was considered to be the quintessential underdog. His fiery halftime pep talks to his team were recorded and shown in newsreels. And more times than not, Notre Dame went on to score a huge come-from-behind victory over larger and better-known schools. But now Knute Rockne was dead, the victim of a passenger plane crash in the snows of Kansas, and the world wanted an explanation. When the government finally released its findings, the world was shocked. The cause of the crash that killed Knute Rockne was that a strut made of wood had broken in the plane. Yes, I said wood. Since the time of the Wright brothers, many major airplane components were made of wood. The airlines knew that, but the passengers didn't. The revelation that a wooden part had broken to cause Rockne's death shook airline confidence. People cringed. So the airlines reacted quickly. They issued a call to all aircraft companies to make an all-metal plane, a plane that would not fall apart in midair. And in a very real way, the death of Knute Rockne in the snows of a Kansas cornfield would be the event that would lead to the second great era in aviation. One of the aircraft designers who answered the call was a young genius named Donald Douglas. Now, we need to deconfuse something here. You've all heard of McDonnell Douglas, the airline company that was absorbed by Boeing. The Douglas part of McDonnell Douglas was Donald Douglas. Just a big coincidence. He was a genius. In less than 3 months, without the use of computers, Donald Douglas and his assistant Arthur Raymond created an airplane like nothing that had ever flown before. They called it the Douglas Commercial One, the DC-1. It was a sleek two-engine plane with enormous wings, big windows, state-of-the-art electronics, and most importantly, not a stitch of wood anywhere in that plane, except in some of the interior decorations. Only one DC-1 was ever built. After testing, it was modified slightly, and the DC-2 emerged. Hundreds of them were ordered by the airlines. The plane was safe and cozy. It felt secure. It was built like a tank. But before the first DC-2s rolled off the assembly line, a major airline asked Donald Douglas to make it bigger. The DC-2 sat 14, 7 on each side. The airline wanted a plane that would hold 21. It felt it was necessary to have 21 passengers if the airline were ever going to make money. So Donald Douglas widened the fuselage, increased the wing size, put in another row of seats, and called it the DC-3.